The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the open field. I sat with my back to the wind, the warmth of the flames a comforting contrast to the crisp night air. The sky stretched out like a black canvas, punctuated by a scatter of stars, and the moon hung low, its pale glow barely visible through the thin veil of clouds. It was peaceful, the kind of night that felt removed from the world as if I was the last person alive. I leaned back in my folding chair, sipping from a battered thermos, the bitter taste of coffee grounding me in the moment. The only sounds were the soft rustling of grass and the occasional crack of wood as the fire consumed the last of my kindling. Out here, miles from any town or highway, the silence was all-encompassing. It was just me, the fire, and the endless expanse of the field that stretched out in every direction. I had come here to escape, to clear my head. Life had been hectic lately, too many responsibilities and too little time to handle them. This field, far off the beaten path, was my retreat. I'd been here a few times before, always alone, always finding solace in the isolation. Tonight felt no different, until I saw something in the sky. It started as a flicker, barely noticeable against the stars. I wouldn't have paid it any attention if it hadn't moved. At first, I thought it was a plane, just a dot high above the earth, moving slowly, lazily, like so many others I'd seen while sitting out here. But then it changed. The dot of light blinked out, disappearing entirely for a moment, before reappearing in a different spot. I squinted, leaning forward in my chair. It wasn't a plane. Planes didn't move like that. They didn't just vanish and reappear. My heart began to beat a little faster, and I set the thermos down, my eyes fixed on the strange, shifting light. It blinked out again, only to reappear even closer. I stood up, trying to get a better look. The firelight was too bright, casting a glow around me that made it hard to see into the sky, so I took a few steps away from the fire, out into the field, until the light of the flames was just a faint glow behind me. The object was still there, still moving. It wasn't flying in a straight line either. It darted across the sky in strange, erratic patterns, left, right, then up, almost as if it was scanning the area, searching for something. And it was getting lower. Goosebumps prickled on my arms despite the warmth of my jacket. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't a plane or a helicopter or a drone. It moved too fast, too unpredictably, and the way it disappeared into the dark only to re-emerge seconds later, it didn't sit right. As I watched, the object blinked again, only this time it stayed gone. The sky was empty, the stars shining coldly above, and for a moment I thought maybe it had been a trick of the light, my mind playing games with the shadows. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something blacker than the night itself, something large, gliding silently across the sky. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. The object wasn't emitting light anymore, it was nearly invisible, a massive shape against the backdrop of the night. It had to be low, maybe a few hundred feet above the ground, moving slowly now, deliberately. It was big. Bigger than anything I'd ever seen in the sky. And it was heading directly over me. The fire crackled behind me, but I barely noticed it anymore. My attention was fixed on the sky, on this enormous, silent thing passing overhead. It didn't make a sound, no engine hum, no rotor noise, just the faintest whisper of wind as it glided through the air. The object blocked out the stars as it passed, a shadow so dense it felt like the sky itself had split open. I wanted to move, to run back to the fire, but my legs were rooted to the ground. My breath came in shallow gasps as I watched the black mass drift overhead, so close now I could almost feel the pressure of its presence bearing down on me. And then it stopped. Directly above me, the object halted, hovering in place. My heart thundered in my chest as I stared up at it, a vast, black silhouette against the faint glow of the night sky. It was hard to tell how big it was, easily the size of a commercial plane, maybe larger, but its shape was wrong. Too angular. Too flat. It reminded me of something out of a science fiction movie, something not built for this world. My mouth was dry and I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't anything I had ever heard of or seen before. I blinked rapidly, half expecting it to vanish again, but it stayed there, hovering silently. And then, without warning, a light appeared beneath it. A soft, glowing light, not harsh like a searchlight, but pale, almost curious. It bathed the ground around me in a dim, unnatural glow, illuminating the grass and casting long shadows. The fire, forgotten now, flickered faintly in the distance, as if the object had drained the very life out of its flames. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. But my feet were heavy, my body frozen in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the light, from the massive object hanging silently above me like some predator sizing up its prey. For what felt like an eternity, I stood there, bathed in that cold, eerie light, unable to move, unable to think. My heart pounded in my chest, and a sickening dread began to creep into my gut. This wasn't right. Whatever this was, it wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to be seeing it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light blinked out. The object shifted, turning slowly in the sky before it began to move again, gliding away into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. I stood there in the empty field, my mind racing, my heart still hammering in my chest. What had I just seen? What the hell was that thing? I wanted to believe it had been a dream, some hallucination brought on by the isolation and the cold, but I knew better. I knew that whatever it was, I wasn't supposed to have seen it. And I had the unsettling feeling that someone, somewhere, knew I had. This was just the beginning. The object was gone, swallowed by the night sky, but the cold weight of dread still clung to me like a second skin. My breath came in sharp, shallow bursts, my hands trembling at my sides as I stared into the void where the massive thing had been moments before. My mind raced, trying to process what I had just witnessed. It wasn't a drone or a plane or anything remotely familiar. No, this was something else entirely, something I had no business seeing. My first thought was military. It had to be. Some kind of advanced technology the government was testing out here, far away from prying eyes. They didn't want anyone to know about it, and now I was in their crosshairs. Soldiers would come, I was sure of it, armed, faceless men in tactical gear, ready to drag me off in the dead of night to some secret facility where I'd disappear forever. The thought made my pulse quicken, my muscles tensing as I instinctively backed toward the fire, desperate for the small comfort its flickering warmth provided. The flames crackled softly behind me, a sharp contrast to the dead, empty air of the field. I should leave. I should grab my things and get the hell out of here before they found me. But my legs wouldn't move. A part of me, some foolish, stubborn part, still hoped I had imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a weird atmospheric phenomenon. My eyes could have been playing tricks on me after staring into the fire for too long. But deep down I knew better. That thing had been real and I had seen too much. I kept scanning the sky, waiting for another sign of it, another flicker of light, another glimpse of its black silhouette against the stars, but the sky remained empty, quiet, still, too still. The silence wasn't right. The wind had died down completely, and the night creatures that usually filled the darkness with their calls had gone eerily quiet. The only sound was the crackling of the fire, and even that seemed muffled, as if the very air around me was holding its breath. Then I saw movement. At first, it was just a shift in the shadows at the far edge of the field, barely noticeable against the dark backdrop of the trees. My heart skipped a beat and I squinted, trying to make out what it was. Had the soldiers arrived? Were they already here, creeping through the night to apprehend me? I strained my eyes, but there was nothing. Just shadows. The same shadows that had always been there. Or so I thought. A shape detached itself from the darkness. It was subtle at first, like a ripple in the air, a distortion of the night itself. I blinked, convinced my eyes were playing tricks on me, but when I looked again the shape had moved closer. And it wasn't alone. Figures, tall, thin, and impossibly black, began to emerge from the darkness, slipping soundlessly through the field like shadows come to life. They weren't soldiers. They weren't anything human. My blood ran cold. They were people, but not. Their forms were vague, undefined, as if they were made from the night itself. I couldn't make out any features. No faces, no clothes, just dark, shifting shapes that moved with an unnatural grace, gliding silently across the field toward me. I took a step back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The fire's warmth felt distant now, barely a flicker of heat in the growing cold of the night. My mind screamed at me to run, to get as far away from these things as possible, but I was frozen in place, staring as the figures grew nearer. One by one, they emerged from the darkness, surrounding the spot where the object had hovered. There had to be at least a dozen of them, their forms blending into the night so completely it was hard to tell where they ended and the shadows began. They moved in perfect silence, as if they weren't even touching the ground. I watched, horrified, as they gathered in a loose circle around the spot where the object had been, their heads turning toward each other, as though they were communicating without words. The way they moved, the way they seemed to melt in and out of the shadows, it was wrong. Unnatural. And then as one they turned toward me. Panic surged through my chest. I took another step back, my heel hitting the edge of the fire pit, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The shadows didn't flinch. They just kept coming, their forms rippling, stretching as they glided across the grass, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. I spun on my heel, my mind screaming run, but before I could make it more than a few feet, something cold and solid wrapped around my wrist. I gasped, jerking my arm away, but the grip was ironclad. One of the shadows had caught up to me, its hand, or what passed for a hand, clamping down on my wrist like a vice. I looked down in horror, expecting to see fingers, but there were none. Just a dark, shapeless mass that extended from the figure's arm, gripping me with impossible strength. I tugged, pulled, desperate to break free, but the thing held fast, dragging me backward toward the others. My heart pounded in my throat as I struggled, my legs kicking up dirt as I fought to stay upright. And then I heard a voice. "You've seen too much." The words weren't spoken aloud. They were inside my head, cold and mechanical, like the echo of a thought that wasn't mine. My breath caught in my throat as the figure yanked me closer, its featureless face looming inches from mine. "You've seen too much," it repeated, the voice like a low, rumbling hum that made my skull vibrate. The others had stopped moving, watching with their faceless heads tilted ever so slightly in my direction. I could feel them, feel their presence pressing in on me, suffocating me. "Let go," I shouted, my voice cracking in the cold air. But it was useless. My words fell into the void, swallowed by the overwhelming silence of the night. The shadow tightened its grip, pulling me closer still, and I could feel the icy tendrils of its form creeping up my arm, leaching the warmth from my skin. I struggled harder, panic consuming me. My vision blurred, my chest tightening as the reality of what was happening sank in. These weren't soldiers. They weren't anything human. They were something else, something I wasn't supposed to see. The fire crackled behind me, a distant reminder of the world I was quickly being dragged away from. I clawed at the ground, my fingers digging into the dirt, desperate for something, anything to hold on to. But the shadows didn't care. They had me and they weren't letting go. "You've seen too much," the voice repeated, more insistent now, as if the thing was angry. "You're not supposed to be here." I gasped, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. I didn't mean to," I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. "I was just camping." "I didn't." The shadow didn't care. It yanked me off the ground, my feet dangling helplessly as it lifted me into the air, its form shifting and rippling around me like a living void. And then, just when I thought it was over, the figure paused. Its head tilted again, as if listening to something only it could hear. The others remained still, watching, waiting. Then, without warning, it dropped me. I hit the ground hard, the air rushing from my lungs as I collapsed in a heap at the shadow's feet. For a moment I lay there, dazed, gasping for breath, my limbs weak and shaking. The figures loomed over me, their dark forms blending into the night. And then they turned. One by one, the shadows began to melt back into the darkness, their forms dissolving into the night until there was nothing left. In a matter of seconds they were gone, leaving me alone in the field with only the dying fire and the oppressive silence. I didn't wait. Scrambling to my feet, I bolted, not caring where I went as long as it was far away from that place.